You knew your neighbors, not just their names, but their routines, their cars, their children, their dogs, the particular way their front door sounded when it closed, what time they left for work in the morning, when they mowed their lawn, whether they were home or away based on whether lights were on or curtains were drawn. This knowledge wasn't surveillance, it was simply the natural result of living in close proximity, of being outside, of paying attention to the life happening around you. The neighborhood was your social world in a way that's hard to explain to people who've grown up with digital communication. These weren't people you'd chosen to connect with through shared interests or carefully curated friend requests. They were people who happened to live near you. And that proximity created relationship, whether you'd planned it or not. You shared a street, a block, a small territory, and that made you neighbors. And being neighbors meant something. You'd see them constantly, not by arrangement, but simply because you were both outside at the same time. You'd be watering your lawn, and they'd be checking their mailbox, and you'd wave, and maybe that would be it. Or maybe one of you would walk over and a conversation would start. These weren't scheduled interactions. They happened organically, spontaneously, dozens of times a week, and they accumulated into relationship. The front yard was your interface with the neighborhood, not a private fenced space, but a semi-public zone where you performed certain activities, mowing, gardening, washing the car, sitting on the porch, that made you visible and available for interaction. When you were in your front yard, you were announcing your presence, making yourself accessible. Neighbors would stop to chat as they walked by. Children would cut across your lawn. The dog from 2 houses down would wander over to say hello. Your father would be out mowing on a Saturday morning, and Mr. Henderson from next door would be doing the same, and they'd both pause their mowers and meet at the property line to exchange a few words. Nothing profound, commentary on the weather, mention of the baseball game last night, a question about whether the trash pickup was delayed this week. 5 minutes, 10 at most, and then they'd both return to their mowing. But those brief exchanges, repeated week after week, season after season, built something. Not friendship necessarily, but familiarity. Mutual recognition, a sense of being part of the same small community. The fence between properties, if there was one, became a meeting point rather than a barrier. Your mother and Mrs. Patterson from next door would both be in their respective backyards, your mother hanging laundry, Mrs. Patterson tending her tomato plants, and they'd drift toward the fence and stand there talking for 20 minutes, half an hour. These fence conversations were a particular genre of neighborly interaction, casual, meandering, interrupted by the demands of whatever task had brought you outside in the first place, but sustained over years until each woman knew a great deal about the other's life, worries, family dynamics, health concerns, opinions. You borrowed things from neighbors, not as a last resort, but as a normal part of household functioning. You'd run out of sugar while making a cake, and your mother would send you next door to ask if you could borrow a cup. And you'd go, knock on the door, make the request, and the neighbor would invite you in, or would disappear briefly and return with the sugar, and you'd thank them and promise to return it, and sometimes you would, and sometimes you wouldn't. But it didn't really matter, because next week they'd be at your door borrowing eggs, and the informal economy of neighborly exchange would continue. People borrowed tools, lawn mowers when yours broke, ladders for projects that required height, folding chairs when you were having people over and didn't have enough seating. They borrowed expertise. Your father would help Mr. Chen fix his car, and Mr. Chen would help your father with some electrical work. And these exchanges of skill and labor created networks of obligation and reciprocity that bound the neighborhood together. Information spread through the neighborhood without phones, without group chats, without any deliberate communication infrastructure. It spread through conversation, through observation, through the simple fact that people were outside and aware of what was happening around them. Someone would mention something to someone else, who would mention it to a third person, and within a day or two, everyone on the block would know that the Johnsons were moving, or that the Petersons' daughter got into college, or that old Mr. Williams was in the hospital. This wasn't exactly gossip, though it sometimes crossed that line. It was more like a communal awareness, a shared knowledge base about the neighborhood's residents and their circumstances. You knew when someone was struggling, when a marriage was in trouble, when someone had lost their job, when a family was dealing with illness. And sometimes that knowledge translated into help. Casseroles would appear on doorsteps, offers to mow the lawn or watch the kids would be made. The neighborhood took care of its own, not through any organized system, but through informal networks of care and reciprocity. Children formed the most intricate neighborhood networks. You'd finish breakfast and go outside and you'd find other kids, the ones from 3 houses down, the ones from across the street, the ones from around the corner. You'd gravitate toward each other the way water finds its level, and you'd form packs, groups that shifted in composition but maintained continuity across days and weeks and summers. You'd move between houses with remarkable fluidity. You'd start playing in your own yard, migrate to someone else's yard, end up in the vacant lot at the end of the street, circle back through someone's side yard, spend an hour at another kid's house. Parents had informal arrangements. Their kids could come to your house, your kids could go to theirs, and no one needed to call ahead or arrange specific times. You just showed up, knocked on the door or walked in if the door was open, and asked if your friend could play. Some houses became gathering points, maybe because they had better toys or a more interesting yard or more lenient parents, or just because of some ineffable quality that made them feel like the center of neighborhood kid life. You'd spend hours there, sprawled on the living room floor or playing in the backyard, and the parent of that house would accept your presence with remarkable tolerance, occasionally providing snacks or telling everyone to keep it down, but mostly just letting the horde of children do their thing. These weren't play dates in the modern sense. They weren't scheduled or supervised or structured. Parents didn't hover, they didn't arrange activities, they just sent you outside with the expectation that you'd find something to do and someone to do it with, and you almost always did. The neighborhood itself was the playdate infrastructure, a built-in social network of children who were available because they lived nearby and they were bored and they wanted someone to play with too. You'd call on friends by knocking on their door and asking if they could come out. Sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't. They had chores, or they were eating dinner, or they were in trouble and restricted to the house. If they couldn't play, you'd try someone else. If no one was available, you'd occupy yourself until someone emerged, or you'd go home and find something to do there. The fluidity of it all, the casual availability, created a social texture that modern scheduled childhood has largely lost. Mealtimes would scatter everyone back to their own houses. Your mother would call you for dinner, actually call, standing on the porch or in the street, raising her voice to reach wherever you were, and you'd come running. After dinner, you might go back out if it was still light, especially in summer when the days stretched long. The neighborhood would fill again with children and adults, people on porches, lawn chairs, and driveways, the social life of the street resuming after the brief intermission of dinner. Block parties were occasional but memorable events. Someone would decide to organize one. Usually this meant 1 or 2 families taking the lead and spreading the word door to door. You'd block off the street with sawhorses or parked cars, set up long tables in the middle of the road, and everyone would bring food, potluck style, each family contributing whatever they were good at or whatever they had. Hamburgers and hot dogs would be grilled, potato salad and coleslaw and baked beans would appear in enormous bowls. Someone would bring a watermelon, someone else would make their famous chocolate cake. Adults would cluster in conversation groups, drinking beer or lemonade, talking for hours. Children would play in packs, emboldened by the temporary transformation of the street into a car-free zone, by the permission to stay up late, by the festive atmosphere. The block party wasn't about anything in particular. It wasn't a celebration of a specific event. It was just a gathering, a recognition of community, a chance to spend time together in a more deliberate way than the casual daily interactions allowed. Winter changed the neighborhood's rhythms, but didn't eliminate interaction. After a heavy snowfall, you'd see neighbors helping each other shovel driveways. Your father would do his own driveway and then, without being asked, would continue and do the elderly widow's driveway next door. Teenagers would go around offering to shovel walks for money. Children would build snow forts and have snowball fights that spanned multiple yards, creating temporary alliances and rivalries that would last until the snow melted. When someone moved in, the neighborhood noticed immediately. The moving truck was a signal, and people would drift over to introduce themselves, to offer help carrying boxes, to get a sense of who these new people were. Your mother might bake something to bring over, cookies or a casserole, as a welcome gesture. She'd knock on the door, introduce herself, present the food, and make the initial connection that would either develop into a neighborly relationship or remain at the level of polite acquaintance, depending on personalities and circumstances. When someone moved away, the departure rippled through the neighborhood. For children especially, the loss of a friend to relocation was significant. They were moving to a different part of town or to a different state, and you'd probably never see them again. There were no easy ways to stay in touch. You might exchange addresses and promise to write letters, and maybe you would for a while, but usually the friendship would fade, maintained only in memory. The friend would be replaced eventually by whoever moved into their house, and neighborhood life would continue, but you'd remember them, the particular configuration of your street when they were still part of it. Neighborhood boundaries were clear and sometimes fiercely defended, at least by children. You knew which blocks were your territory and which belonged to other groups of kids. Crossing into another neighborhood could be fraught. You might be challenged, told to go back where you came from, or you might be accepted, temporarily adopted into their games and social structure. But your own neighborhood was home territory, the place where you belonged, where you knew everyone, and everyone knew you. Not every neighborhood was equally cohesive. Some streets were friendlier than others. Some had a core group of families who were particularly close, while others remained collections of individuals who lived near each other without much interaction. Economic factors played a role. More stable, middle-class neighborhoods often had more developed social networks, while poorer areas might have less leisure time for casual socializing, and wealthier areas might have more privacy, larger lots, less need to borrow and share. There were tensions, too. Neighbor disputes about property lines, noise, parking, how people maintained their yards. People who didn't like each other but had to coexist because they couldn't easily avoid one another. The nosiness that came with everyone knowing your business, the lack of privacy, the sense that you were always being observed, judged, discussed. The neighborhood could feel constricting, especially if you didn't fit the dominant culture, or if you valued your independence and resented the social expectations. But for all its limitations, the neighborhood created a kind of social density that's largely disappeared. You couldn't be anonymous. You couldn't isolate yourself completely. You were embedded in a network of human relationships that existed primarily in physical space, that required face-to-face interaction, that couldn't be filtered or curated or turned off. You knew people in their entirety, not the carefully selected images they chose to share, but the reality of them as they moved through daily life, in their strengths and weaknesses, their good moods and bad moods, their kindness and their flaws. Now neighborhoods are quieter. People pull into their garages and close the door behind them without interacting with anyone. Children's social lives are scheduled and supervised, happening in organized activities rather than organic street play. You might not know your neighbors' names even after living next to them for years. Communication happens through neighborhood apps and group chats rather than fence-line conversations. The front yard has become decorative rather than social. People are friendly when they encounter each other, but the encounters are rare. This has advantages: more privacy, more control over your social life, less obligation to maintain relationships with people you might not genuinely like. But it's also lonelier. The neighborhood as a social safety net has largely disappeared. The casual daily interactions that created familiarity and trust have been replaced by carefully scheduled socializing with people who often live miles away. Community, when it exists, is chosen and constructed rather than emerging naturally from proximity. You can't fully recreate what existed before. The world has changed. Suburbs are designed differently, cultural expectations are different, and the technology that enables isolation also provides genuine benefits. But you can make choices. You can spend time in your front yard. You can introduce yourself to neighbors. You can let your children play outside without hovering. You can attend neighborhood gatherings when they happen. You can borrow and lend. You can have conversations across fence lines. You can build, slowly and through repeated small interactions, the kind of neighborly relationships that once happened automatically but now require intention. Because what the neighborhood provided wasn't just convenience or entertainment. It was the experience of being known by the people who shared your physical space, of being part of something larger than your individual household, of living in a web of relationships that held you, especially when those relationships weren't perfect. It was the understanding that you weren't alone, that help was nearby if you needed it, that your life intersected with other lives in ways both mundane and meaningful. And that experience, that sense of belonging to a place in a community, is something worth remembering and perhaps worth trying to rebuild.